January 1943. The Barents Sea lies silent beneath a ceiling of blue-white ice. Far below, in the crushing darkness, a German U-boat glides slowly, its steel hull groaning against the cold pressure. The commander stands rigid inside the conning tower, his breath forming thin ghosts in the stale air. Above him, 2 meters of frozen sea. Safety, he believes, a wall no Allied plane or radar can penetrate. Then, faintly, it comes. A sound, a single mechanical heartbeat. Ping. It echoes through the submarine's hull, alien and precise. The crew freezes. Another ping, then another, closer, each one bouncing off the steel like a knock from the deep. The commander grips the periscope handles, his confidence melting into dread. Sonar. American. Under the ice. The crew scrambles to dive deeper, but there is nowhere to go. Only black water and the sound of discovery closing in. For the first time, German command would face a terrifying truth. The Arctic ice no longer hid them, because the Americans had found a way to hear through silence itself. By early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached a grim equilibrium, a deadly rhythm of convoys and counterstrikes stretching from North America to the Arctic Circle. The sea was not merely water, it was a front line. German U-boats prowled the cold corridors between Greenland, Iceland, and the British Isles. Their mission simple, but devastating. Starve Britain. Every torpedo that struck a freighter was a blow to Allied supply lines, to fuel, food, and the will to fight. For months, the U-boats seemed invincible. Allied convoys vanished into the depths, their wrecks marked only by slicks of oil and scattered debris. Admiral Karl Dönitz's Rudel tactic, the wolf pack strategy, turned the Atlantic into a hunting ground. Dozens of submarines coordinated to attack convoys under cover of night and storm. In 1942 alone, over 8 million tons of Allied shipping were sent to the bottom. Each ton was a quiet message to London. You can't win what you can't feed. But the Allies were not idle. In laboratories across Britain, Canada, and the United States, engineers and physicists studied an invisible weapon: sound. If radar had conquered the sky, sonar would conquer the deep. Known then as ASTIC, Allied Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, the technology could bounce high-frequency sound waves off submarine hulls, revealing their position beneath the surface. Yet the ocean was not uniform. The Arctic and North Atlantic were unpredictable, filled with temperature layers, dense ice cover, and acoustic distortions that swallowed or bent sound. American scientists believed these limitations could be overcome. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, the Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory worked day and night refining sonar transducers that could adapt to the freezing, salt-heavy waters of the North. They discovered how temperature gradients affected wave propagation, how ice reflected and scattered sound, and how to use those very obstacles as amplifiers. By late 1942, new sonar sets were fitted onto convoy escorts, their operators trained to interpret the faint echoes that most dismissed as ice or whales. Meanwhile, a new front was opening: the Arctic convoys. From Britain and Iceland, Allied merchant ships braved the world's most hostile waters to deliver supplies to the Soviet Union via Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. The routes were narrow, ice-choked, and constantly shadowed by German aircraft and U-boats based in Norway. These convoys, coded PQ and JW, were lifelines for the Eastern Front, carrying tanks, planes, ammunition, and food through seas that could freeze a man solid in minutes. The Germans believed the Arctic was their advantage. Ice flows distorted sonar signals, magnetic compasses faltered, and periscopes were useless in fog or frost. A U-boat beneath the ice, they thought, was untouchable. But American naval strategists were learning to turn the environment itself into an ally. By measuring how sound refracted beneath the ice layers, They realized sonar could travel farther in cold water than in temperate seas, if tuned to the right frequencies. What had been thought of as a shield could become an acoustic lens. By early 1943, the U.S. Navy began equipping destroyer escorts and corvettes with improved sonar sets specifically calibrated for Arctic operations. At the same time, depth charge tactics evolved. Instead of random barrages, they were now guided by sonar readings, precise, methodical, scientific. The sea was no longer an arena of chance, but a battlefield mapped by sound. The Germans noticed the change, though they didn't understand it. Their U-boats were being tracked in places once considered safe, their escapes narrowing, their confidence eroding. Captains reported phantom echoes and strange acoustic behavior. Some blamed new Allied aircraft or magnetic anomalies. Few realized the truth. The Americans had extended their reach into the frozen deep. And under the still surface of the Barents Sea, that truth was about to be proven beyond doubt. In 1943, the U.S. Navy's war against the U-boat was no longer a naval campaign. It was an engineering crusade. The oceans had become a laboratory, and every sound mattered. At the heart of this transformation was a small group of physicists and oceanographers working under secrecy in New England. Among them were researchers from Harvard, Columbia, and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, drawn together by a single mission: to make sound see through ice. They studied not ships, but whales. They recorded how sound carried through frozen layers, how vibrations bent under pressure, and how microscopic air pockets trapped in the ice reflected sonar pulses like mirrors. What they found changed everything. That the Arctic, far from being an acoustic dead zone, could serve as a massive sound chamber if the frequencies were tuned correctly. By manipulating the pulse length and amplitude of sonar waves, they could send signals that traveled along the underside of the ice like whispers across a cathedral roof, bouncing back with clarity that startled even the engineers. The discovery was shared with the Office of Naval Research and rapidly field-tested on newly built escort vessels, particularly the P. Edsall-class destroyer escorts and British-built Flower-class corvettes serving in convoy defense. The sonar operators on these ships became the unseen warriors of the Atlantic. They trained for months to interpret faint, distorted echoes. The difference between a whale, an iceberg, or a U-boat hull could be the difference between silence and survival. But sonar alone wasn't enough. It needed integration. That's when the Allied Convoy Command introduced combined acoustic and radar sweeps, coordinating surface sonar readings with airborne radar from patrol aircraft like the PBY Catalina and B-24 Liberator. Aircraft could track a submarine's last known position when it surfaced. Destroyers could then triangulate its submerged location through sonar grids. The result was a deadly symphony of detection. And it began to work. In the frozen corridors north of Norway, the Germans launched Operation Wonderland, attempting to cut off Arctic convoys heading toward Murmansk. They expected chaos. Instead, they found precision. Allied ships maneuvered with uncanny awareness, dropping depth charges almost exactly over their targets. At first, German intelligence dismissed reports of sonar under ice as Allied propaganda. The concept seemed absurd. Sound waves, they believed, could not penetrate the complex density of frozen seawater. Yet U-boats kept vanishing. By mid-1943, Admiral Dönitz began to suspect the Allies had developed a breakthrough in underwater detection. He ordered his engineers at Kiel and Lübeck to investigate. The German Naval Acoustic Research Institute conducted experiments with hydrophones and echo sounders, confirming that sonar signals indeed behaved differently in extreme cold. But by the time they attempted countermeasures, such as rubberized hull coatings, decoy buoys, and acoustic torpedoes, it was already too late. The advantage had shifted irreversibly. Meanwhile, the Americans didn't stop with sonar. They pioneered multi-beam scanning, early attempts at side-scan sonar, allowing a destroyer to project sound laterally and below simultaneously. In Arctic conditions, this meant they could see beneath the edges of ice floes where U-boats often hid to escape detection. It turned hiding places into traps. One of the first recorded instances of this new capability came during convoy JW-56B in February 1944. A German U-boat, U-739, tried to slip under the ice after firing torpedoes at an American Liberty ship. The escort USS Whitehurst locked onto a faint echo that appeared to drift sideways, a characteristic sonar signature of reflection beneath ice cover. It was enough. The destroyer executed a depth charge run, its charges timed to the fraction of a second, based on acoustic return delay. The explosion ruptured the U-boat's pressure hull, sending it spiraling into the abyss. For the first time, a submarine had been sunk while hiding under Arctic ice. The psychological impact was immense. German commanders could no longer trust the ocean's silence. Their best defense, nature itself, had betrayed them. From that point forward, the Battle of the Atlantic was no longer decided by steel or courage, but by sound, the most primal and invisible force of war. And as that realization spread through the ranks of the Kriegsmarine, America's scientists were already preparing the next leap. To turn sonar from a weapon of detection into a weapon of prediction. To understand how sonar under ice changed the war, one must step inside the minds of those who lived by sound. The U-boat war was not just mechanical, it was psychological. In the crushing dark below the sea, men did not see their enemy. They heard him. Every click, every echo, every distant hum became a possible death sentence. The sea was filled with ghosts, and sonar gave them shape. U-boat crews were chosen for their discipline, endurance, and iron nerves. Yet beneath the Arctic, even those traits began to crack. The temperature inside the submarine rarely rose above freezing. Condensation turned bulkheads into slick sheets of frost. Their breath condensed into mist. Their hands stiffened, and every sound, the groan of the hull, the creak of pressure valves, sounded like an approaching threat. Then came the sonar pings. The crew could feel them. Vibrations crawling up their boots through the steel floor. The rhythmic, methodical ping, ping, ping became a symbol of inevitability, a clock ticking toward destruction. Sailors described it as being hunted by sound itself. Many tried to stay calm by memorizing sonar patterns, convincing themselves they could tell when a destroyer would strike. But the new American equipment no longer followed predictable rhythms. Its frequencies changed, its intervals shifted. It was no longer a metronome, it was a conversation. And the U-boats could not understand the language. Before 1943, U-boats owned the initiative. They dictated the terms of engagement, emerging from the depths when visibility and weather favored them. But sonar under ice flipped that advantage. The Americans could now track submarines even through partial ice cover, meaning U-boats had to move constantly to avoid triangulation. This constant motion created fatigue and operational chaos. Every few minutes, a submarine might have to adjust depth or heading to escape sonar beams, burning precious fuel and oxygen. It turned stealth into suffocation. Convoy tactics also evolved. Instead of reacting to attacks, Allied escorts began forming hunter-killer groups, small task forces that patrolled probable U-boat routes rather than waiting defensively. Using sonar to sweep vast arcs under the ice, these groups anticipated ambushes before they happened. Destroyers now attacked not where submarines were, but where the echoes suggested they would be. The Arctic ice acted as an amplifier, carrying sonar reflections over long distances. The U-boats could no longer hide. Even silence betrayed them. At the core of this transformation was engineering, the cold, methodical science of acoustics. Traditional sonar systems had been limited by the thermocline, a natural temperature barrier that bent sound waves and created blind spots. But under the ice, temperature layers were consistent, allowing longer-range detection. The U.S. Navy exploited this by developing variable-depth sonar arrays, which could be lowered beneath the ship's hull to bypass surface interference. Operators could adjust the sonar's angle to penetrate ice layers using data on salinity and temperature gathered by oceanographic buoys. Each adjustment refined the echo. Every ping became sharper, every return more detailed. These advancements were paired with the emerging field of acoustic analysis. Computers did not yet exist, but analog oscillographs and cathode ray displays allowed operators to see sound for the first time. They could distinguish a U-boat's curved hull from the jagged edge of an iceberg by the echo pattern alone. The German Navy, still relying heavily on hydrophones, passive listening devices, was outmatched. Their technology could detect propeller noise, but it could not see through ice. They were deaf in a world that had learned to hear. The shift went beyond detection. It reshaped command philosophy. The U.S. Navy's sonar research units began working directly with tactical commanders, scientists sailing alongside officers on convoy escorts, analyzing sonar returns in real time. This unprecedented collaboration blurred the line between laboratory and battlefield. Every encounter became a lesson, every sinking a data point. The ocean itself became an experiment. For Germany, this development was invisible but devastating. Dönitz's doctrine of wolf pack warfare relied on surprise and synchronization, both impossible under constant sonar surveillance. What had once been a coordinated pack hunt was now a desperate scattering of hunted predators. And through the thin Arctic twilight, the Americans refined their weapon of silence, proving that the most powerful weapon in naval warfare wasn't explosive at all. It was sound. While German commanders struggled to comprehend how sonar could pierce the Arctic veil, American naval innovation was accelerating with quiet, relentless precision. What began as laboratory curiosity had evolved into industrial doctrine. In just 2 years, the U.S. had transformed from a nation learning the language of sound to one speaking it fluently and weaponizing it. The United States understood early that control of the Atlantic meant control of the war. Radar ruled the skies. Sonar would rule the depths. But in the Arctic, sonar faced its greatest challenge: the unpredictable chaos of frozen seas. Ice distorted echoes, refracted beams, and sometimes created false returns that could trick even the most skilled operator. To counter this, the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships collaborated with scientists from Bell Laboratories, Harvard, and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography to create an entirely new sonar design, the QHB scanning sonar. Unlike older models that emitted fixed pulses, the QHB could sweep across variable arcs, automatically compensating for reflection patterns beneath ice. It became the eye that adjusted to the cold, allowing operators to visualize submarine movement in near real time on phosphorescent displays. But technological advantage alone was never enough. The Navy invested heavily in training. Dozens of sonar schools emerged along the American coasts, in Key West, San Diego, and New London, where recruits spent months learning to interpret echoes. They memorized the rhythm of whales, the signature of drifting ice, and the sound print of enemy propellers. By 1944, the best sonar men could identify a U-boat class by its echo return long before they ever saw it. The U.S. Navy understood that the true weapon wasn't the sonar pulse. It was what it did to the enemy's mind. Every time a submarine detected a ping, panic rippled through the crew. It wasn't just fear of attack. It was the fear of inevitability. You could run. You could dive, but the sound followed. It always followed. German logs recovered after the war described the mental toll in chilling detail. One captain wrote, "It is like hearing your own death in advance. The sound is calm, unhurried. It knows it will find you." Psychiatrists who later studied U-boat survivors found recurring symptoms: sleeplessness, tremors, auditory hallucinations. Some sailors reported hearing pings even when their subs were safe in port. The U.S. Navy had turned sonar into more than detection. It had become a psychological siege. The sea no longer offered escape. Silence itself had become hostile. For the American sailors behind those sonar consoles, the experience was paradoxical. They were waging a war they couldn't see, fighting men they would never meet, killing enemies they never looked in the eye. Destroyer crews described hearing faint metallic groans through sonar just before a submarine imploded, the final echo of lives ending in silence. Some operators confessed feeling haunted by those sounds, realizing that the same pings that ensured their survival also condemned others. This emotional burden was rarely spoken of in official reports, but it left a mark. In post-war memoirs, many described sonar duty as the loneliest combat on Earth. Unlike the roar of aerial dogfights or artillery fire, sonar warfare was a whisper, a quiet duel where victory was measured in the absence of sound. What made America's sonar campaign under ice even more devastating was the integration of intelligence. The Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park provided decrypted Enigma signals revealing German U-boat positions. Combined with acoustic tracking, this allowed American and British commanders to predict likely hiding zones beneath Arctic ice fields. When convoys like JW-58 or RA-64 set sail, sonar-equipped escorts already knew which regions of the sea to scan more intensively. For the Germans, it felt supernatural, as though the Allies could sense their every move. In reality, it was mathematics, engineering, and intelligence converging with chilling precision. In the broader cultural psyche of the war, sonar represented something profound, a triumph of intellect over instinct. Where German engineering favored brute efficiency and mechanical perfection, American progress thrived on adaptation and collaboration. Physicists, naval officers, and even musicians, men trained to understand resonance and vibration, contributed to sonar's evolution. It symbolized the fusion of art and science, emotion and logic that defined the Allied war effort. In Berlin, reports of sonar under ice reached the upper command in disbelief. German scientists at Kiel dismissed it as propaganda, a technical impossibility. Yet, by early 1944, as Arctic convoy losses dropped sharply and U-boat returns dwindled, even skeptics in the Kriegsmarine began to accept the truth. The Americans had broken the silence of the sea. By turning sound into strategy and fear into weaponry, they had transformed one of nature's harshest frontiers into an acoustic battlefield. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would shake the myth of U-boat invincibility. Not with bombs or torpedoes, but with echoes. The decisive test came in the early months of 1944, when the Arctic convoys once again set sail toward Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, lifelines to the Soviet Union. Each voyage was a gamble through darkness, ice, and fire. The Germans called the route the Todesstrecke, the death lane. But this time, the hunters were not the same. Convoy JW-56B, launched from Loch Ewe in late January, was escorted by a mixed Allied screen: American destroyers, British corvettes, and Canadian frigates. Every escort bristled with radar, depth charges, and, crucially, the new variable frequency sonar systems capable of tracking sound through Arctic ice. The sea temperature hovered just below freezing, the air thick with snow and static. It was a place where even machines seemed to groan under nature's weight. Beneath the ice drifted U-739 and U-956, waiting in ambush. Their orders from Admiral Dönitz were clear: strike hard, then vanish under the frozen canopy. The U-boats were to use the ice itself as camouflage, slipping beneath floes to break sonar contact and surface again miles away. It was a plan born of experience, For years, the ice had been their shield. But on the night of February 1st, 1944, that shield failed. The destroyer escort USS Whitehurst detected a faint, rhythmic echo, not strong enough for confirmation, but distinct enough to raise suspicion. The sonar operator, Petty Officer John S. McGowan, adjusted the transducer angle by just 2 degrees, a small movement that changed history. The echo returned, sharper, stronger. It wasn't an iceberg. It was steel. McGowan reported contact. The convoy zigzagged, destroyers forming a triangular attack pattern while maintaining convoy speed. Whitehurst emitted short sonar bursts to track movement. HMS Dianthus mirrored the signal from the opposite flank. Within seconds, 2 echoes overlapped on the plotting board. A triangulation beneath the ice. The U-boat was trapped in an acoustic cage. U-739 tried to dive deeper, sliding beneath a thick layer of ice. The commander hoped to lose the sound in the chaotic reverberations below the flow. But the Americans had studied that very phenomenon. Their sonar frequencies had been recalibrated to exploit the ice's reflective underside, turning it into an amplifier rather than an obstacle. Every move the U-boat made now echoed twice, once off the hull, once off the ice. The destroyers closed in. Depth charges were armed, each calibrated by sonar-derived pressure readings. McGowan's last recorded transmission before the strike was simple. Contact steady, range decreasing. At 23:14 hours, Whitehurst released its first pattern, 6 charges in a fan spread. The explosions thundered through the water, followed by a heavy silence. Then, through the static of the sonar receiver, came the unmistakable sound. A hull imploding, collapsing under pressure. The convoy's log noted it without emotion. Submarine destroyed. Ice overhead at contact zone. It was the first confirmed kill beneath Arctic ice. For the Germans, the news was both unbelievable and catastrophic. Dönitz initially refused to believe that sonar could function in such conditions. He demanded acoustic proof, insisting that the loss was due to minefields or mechanical failure. But as more U-boats vanished in the same northern corridors, the pattern became undeniable. By March 1944, Allied escorts sank 6 U-boats within Arctic latitudes, 3 of them confirmed under partial ice cover. For the first time, the Atlantic had become transparent. What made these encounters so distinct was their silence. There were no grand naval clashes, no surface duels, only pings, echoes, and sudden eruptions of water. Allied sonar operators compared it to playing chess in a hurricane. Every move depended on seconds, on how quickly they could interpret fading echoes and shifting frequencies. German survivors later described the terror of those final moments, the sound of sonar pings bouncing endlessly, like whispers in a coffin. Some U-boat captains tried desperate measures, firing decoy torpedoes or releasing noise-generating buoys. But under ice, these tricks backfired. The echoes simply multiplied, creating acoustic chaos that betrayed their position even faster. In one incident, U-425, operating north of Bear Island, tried to hide beneath a collapsing ice sheet after attacking a Soviet-bound convoy. The sonar on HMS Bickerton picked up the distorted reverberations from the ice, correctly interpreting them as movement rather than static. A single depth charge run ended the submarine's career in seconds. The technology had reached a point where even nature's randomness could be decoded. For the first time, the ocean itself sided with the Allies, and as the Arctic filled with the ghosts of sinking submarines, a chilling realization spread across German command that the Allies had learned not only to master the sea, but to listen to it. News of the Arctic sinkings reached Berlin in fragments, coded, hesitant, and disbelieved. Admiral Karl Dönitz, head of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm, studied the reports with a grim, narrowing gaze. The North Atlantic, once his hunting ground, now seemed to swallow his submarines whole. Each message began the same way. Contact lost after sonar pursuit. No aircraft sighted. No surface engagement. Just sound, then silence. Dönitz demanded clarity. Could the Allies truly use sonar beneath ice? His scientists at Kiel insisted it was impossible. Sound could not pass through such chaotic mediums. Yet losses mounted. The numbers didn't lie. 6 submarines gone in 2 months. Most in sectors long considered safe under frozen cover. The Germans had built their submarine doctrine on one assumption: that nature, cold, and depth would protect them. Now, nature itself had turned traitor. The response from Berlin was frantic but methodical. Dönitz convened emergency conferences with the Naval Acoustic Research Institute and the Torpedo Experimental Command. Orders went out to develop Eisbären Schutz, polar protection measures for Arctic operations. Engineers experimented with new anechoic coatings, sheets of rubber designed to absorb sonar pulses rather than reflect them. But they were crude, heavy, and ineffective in sub-zero waters. The material stiffened and cracked after a single patrol. Attempts to jam sonar signals using acoustic buoys also failed. The ice distorted the interference patterns, often leading Allied ships straight to the decoy source. What truly crushed German morale was the realization that even their most secret routes, under the ice floes near Spitzbergen and the Barents Shelf, were compromised. Allied sonar could map not just the immediate area, but the contours of underwater terrain. Destroyers learned to use ice reflections as acoustic mirrors, bouncing signals across long distances to triangulate submerged movement. The very environment that once hid the U-boats was now broadcasting their positions. For the men aboard those submarines, the psychological disintegration was complete. Survivor testimonies tell of sailors refusing to sleep, terrified of waking to the sound of pings. One radioman from U-425 later recalled, "It was like God knocking on the hull. Every second, closer. Every second, louder." Crews began sabotaging equipment to surface earlier, hoping to surrender rather than suffocate below. Dönitz's command labeled them cowards, but he understood the truth. No man could endure that kind of silence forever. In one haunting episode, recorded by Allied intelligence, the crew of U-625 transmitted a desperate Morse message just before destruction. A broken sequence of letters believed to spell echo. Whether it was a warning or an admission remains unclear. Hours later, sonar operators aboard HMS Beinthun reported rapid collapse noises. Nothing more was ever heard. As panic grew, Dönitz shifted focus from technology to tactics. He ordered U-boats to dive deeper, sometimes beyond safe depth, hoping to escape the sonar's reach. But the Arctic offered no mercy. At extreme depths, the water density amplified sound rather than absorbing it. Pressure warped the hulls. Frost thickened on gauges. Some captains tried silent running, shutting down engines and drifting beneath the ice. But sonar could detect even minute vibrations. Others sought to hide among icebergs, using them as shields. Yet the echoes betrayed every movement. The ice and steel created a unique acoustic signature no human could mistake. Allied intelligence quickly intercepted these desperate adaptations. Reports from HMS Tracker and USS England described erratic maneuvering patterns indicative of panic or confusion. What they didn't know, what only post-war records revealed, was how utterly broken German command cohesion had become. By spring 1944, Dönitz admitted in private correspondence that the enemy has learned to hear better than we can see. The final blow came with convoy RA-59, returning from Murmansk in May 1944. 8 German submarines ambushed the convoy under cover of snow squalls and ice fog. Within hours, 5 were destroyed. The Allies suffered minimal damage. One of the destroyers, HMS Goodall, was lost. But the cost to Germany was fatal. Post-battle analysis showed that Allied ships had used acoustic triangulation through layered ice, a technique so advanced that German scientists later compared it to radar. Dönitz's staff was stunned. The Kriegsmarine's most elite weapon had become an instrument of mass suicide. When Dönitz received the report of Goodall's sinking, he did not rage. He simply folded the message and stared at the map of the Arctic routes pinned to his wall. He whispered, "We can no longer hide." Those words marked the symbolic end of the U-boat era. The shift was irreversible. Convoy losses dropped by nearly 80% through 1944. While U-boat sinkings reached catastrophic rates, over 40 submarines destroyed each month. The ocean that once belonged to Germany now belonged to sound. Disciplined, scientific, merciless sound. In the ice fields of the North, the balance of fear had changed. No longer did sailors dread the unseen torpedo in the dark. Now, it was the submariner who trembled at the faintest ping. And from that faint vibration under frozen seas, the course of the entire Atlantic War began to tilt. The silence that once protected Germany had become the silence that buried it. By the summer of 1944, the great underwater empire of the Kriegsmarine was collapsing in silence. What had once been a vast, predatory fleet of hundreds of U-boats prowling the Atlantic was now a scattered collection of hunted survivors. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. In 1942, U-boats had sunk over 1,000 Allied ships. By mid-1944, that number had fallen to fewer than 100. Meanwhile, Allied forces were destroying submarines faster than Germany could build them. The reason was no longer mystery or luck. It was mastery. The Allies had learned to hear war. Sonar changed not only tactics, but psychology. German commanders who once boasted of striking invisible and unstoppable now moved in fear of being detected before they even fired. The Arctic routes, once seen as the Kriegsmarine's sanctuary, had become killing fields. Every sonar-equipped destroyer, corvette, and aircraft carrier escort now represented an invisible net of sound stretched across the ocean. The U-boats, cornered and blind, had nowhere left to run. In the months following the disaster of convoy RA-59, German naval morale disintegrated. Reports from the front revealed a chilling pattern: increasing mechanical failures, aborted missions, and crews unwilling to submerge fully. Some captains preferred surrender to certain death beneath the ice. Dönitz attempted to rally his men with speeches about endurance and honor beneath the waves. But even he knew the truth. Endurance meant dying unheard. 15. Americans and British continued to refine their sonar systems with relentless precision. By late 1944, the QHB and 147B Sword sonar became standard equipment on Allied ships, capable of maintaining target lock even while maneuvering at speed. This removed the last German advantage: mobility. In earlier years, submarines could escape by turning sharply after detection, breaking the sonar beam. Now, the new scanning systems followed them through every twist and dive. The ocean had become transparent. To compound Germany's woes, Allied air patrols, equipped with radar and magnetic anomaly detectors, began working in tandem with sonar-equipped destroyers. The coordination was mathematical. Aircraft forced submarines to submerge, where sonar would find them. Sonar forced them to surface, where aircraft would destroy them. It was a closed loop, a deadly rhythm of detection from which no U-boat could escape. For the Allied sailors, victory brought no joy, only exhaustion. Sonar warfare demanded absolute focus. Operators worked long hours, their ears ringing from constant pings, their nerves worn by the knowledge that a single missed echo could mean hundreds of lives lost. Yet, amidst the tension, there was pride. A quiet acknowledgement that intellect had triumphed where brute strength could not. The war beneath the ice had been fought not by battleships or bombers, but by engineers, mathematicians, and men with headphones pressed to their skulls. For the Germans, the defeat was existential. The U-boat had symbolized Germany's defiance. Silent, predatory, unseen. Its destruction meant more than lost ships. It meant the end of the myth of technological superiority that had fueled Nazi propaganda. The Third Reich had built its confidence on mastery of machine and environment. But America had mastered the invisible. Dönitz, ever the strategist, recognized it. In his private notes, he admitted, "We are no longer fighting the Allies. We are fighting physics." It was an acknowledgement few military leaders ever made, that the war was no longer about courage or command, but about who understood the laws of nature better. With U-boat warfare collapsing, German naval focus turned toward coastal defense and last-ditch measures, mini-submarines, snorkel-equipped Type 21 models, and suicide missions. None could alter the outcome. The Allies, armed with sonar-guided torpedoes and predictive tracking algorithms, simply adapted faster. By the end of 1944, the Atlantic convoys, once the most perilous missions of the war, were sailing with near impunity. Supplies flowed to Britain and the Soviet Union at unprecedented rates, fueling the final offensives that would crush Nazi Germany on land. And so, beneath the frozen ceiling of the North, the final echoes of the once feared U-boat fleet faded into the deep, not with explosions or glory, but with silence. A silence born not of stealth, but of extinction. When the war ended in May 1945, the Allies began dismantling the remains of Germany's once terrifying submarine arm. The docks at Kiel, Lübeck, and Wilhelmshaven were filled with wrecks, rusted hulls, shattered periscopes, and machinery that had once embodied Nazi ambition. Among the debris lay the documents that told the rest of the story. Intelligence teams of the U.S. Navy Technical Mission in Europe examined thousands of pages of logs, test reports, and scientific studies. What they found was not arrogance, but disbelief. German acoustic experts had spent months trying to disprove Allied sonar results, conducting experiments in ice-covered fjords to demonstrate that sound could not penetrate thick ice layers. In one internal memo, an engineer wrote, "Reflection is total. No echo can pass. This is physics, not propaganda." But the physics had changed. Or rather, the understanding of it had. The Americans had gone beyond theoretical limits. They had turned nature itself into a partner. Captured officers spoke openly once the fighting stopped. They described how morale had collapsed after rumors spread that the Allies could see through ice. One commander admitted, "We thought we were fighting ships. We were fighting science." That statement would define the post-war era of military thought. For the Allies, sonar's success under ice proved that information, not size or speed, would rule future wars. Within months, the same laboratories that had developed wartime sonar were absorbed into new organizations. The Office of Naval Research, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and later the Scripps Acoustic Program. Their mission evolved from hunting submarines to understanding the ocean itself. The Cold War began in the echoes of that transition. As relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union hardened, the Arctic once again became a frontier, not for convoys, but for silence and surveillance. The Soviets launched their first nuclear submarines into the same frozen waters where U-boats had died, and the Americans answered with sonar networks stretching across entire oceans. From 1950 onward, the techniques born in the Arctic convoys matured into a vast underwater infrastructure, the Sound Surveillance System, SOSUS. This network of hydrophones, laid along the ocean floor, could detect Soviet submarines thousands of miles away. It worked on the same principle first proven in 1943, sound traveling farther and faster through cold, dense water. Every pulse, every echo traced back to the discovery made under ice. The ocean had become transparent, not through sight, but through sound. In a broader sense, the triumph of sonar transformed oceanography itself. The data collected during wartime, temperature gradients, sound velocity profiles, and salinity studies formed the foundation of modern marine science. What began as an act of war became the beginning of humanity's deeper relationship with the sea. For the first time, humans could map mountains hidden under waves, track whales across hemispheres, and measure the heartbeat of the planet. Yet the human cost of this victory lingered. Many sonar operators left the Navy with damaged hearing, insomnia, and nervous disorders. Some never spoke of what they had done. The long hours of waiting for echoes that meant death. The sound that had saved their convoys haunted their memories. In interviews decades later, veterans often said the same phrase, "We still hear it, the ping." In Germany, survivors of the U-boat service carried their own silence. Memorials were built quietly, often at coastal towns, bearing no slogans, only the names of thousands who never returned. The myth of the noble hunter beneath the waves was replaced by something humbler, the acknowledgement of limits. Even in the empire of steel and will, there were laws greater than men. The lesson resonated through every navy on Earth. By the 1960s, under-ice sonar operations became a permanent feature of global naval strategy. Submarines from both superpowers patrolled the same Arctic corridors, once filled with wreckage, guided by instruments born in the desperate years of 1943 to 44. The technology evolved, but the philosophy remained. He who controls sound controls the sea. And so the war that began with torpedoes ended with echoes. What the Germans had dismissed as impossible became the very language of modern warfare. Quiet, mathematical, relentless. From the cold death of U-boats rose a new kind of dominance. Invisible, scientific, and enduring. The ice that once protected had taught mankind how to listen. The war beneath the ice ended not with triumph, but with understanding. Long after the guns fell silent and the wrecks froze into seabed tombs, one truth remained. The ocean had not been conquered. It had been understood. Sound became the bridge between chaos and control, fear and mastery. In learning to hear through the ice, humanity did something profound. It learned to listen to the world itself. The same waves that once hunted men in submarines would later map the deepest trenches, track migrating whales, and reveal the restless heart of the planet. Science, born from fear, became the language of exploration. For Germany, the lesson was humbling. Their engineers had built machines of terrifying precision, but they could not bend the laws of physics. The ice had sided with the patient, those who observed rather than assumed. For America, victory carried its own burden. The realization that power no longer depended on fire or fury, but on knowledge, invisible, relentless, and enduring. Every ping that echoed beneath the ice was more than a weapon. It was a question. How far will we go to master what we fear? In the decades that followed, the descendants of those sonar pings circled the globe, from Cold War submarines under the polar cap to research vessels mapping coral seas. Each transmission, each faint returning echo, carried the same story. The triumph of curiosity over terror, of sound over silence. The Arctic no longer hides its secrets, but it still remembers the men who tried to. Beneath its frozen calm lie twisted hulls and fragments of steel, monuments to an age when silence was thought to be safety. And through that silence, even now, the echoes continue to travel. Not as warnings, but as whispers of what mankind learned when it finally began to listen.